Over the last quarter century, more than 30 major developed and emerging market economies have adopted a similar framework for monetary policy referred to as inflation targeting. What is inflation targeting? The main feature of inflation targeting is an explicit numerical intermediate target for CPI inflation. In this segment, we will examine the characteristics of the inflation targeting framework. There are two key parts of the inflation targeting framework. First, an explicit numerical target for inflation. Second, a forward-looking monetary policy that adjusts interest rates on the basis of the forecast of the future path of inflation. We can then think of the inflation forecast as the intermediate target of monetary policy. After viewing this segment, you should be able to 1. Characterize the inflation targeting monetary policy framework. Regional economies, including Indonesia, Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, implement an inflation targeting framework. In terms of implementation, these economies use the instruments of the interest rate corridor, open market operations, and standing facilities to achieve a target for the interbank rate. In terms of strategy, the interest rate target is adjusted to achieve a specific target for CPI inflation in order to achieve the ultimate goal of price stability. These regional economies outline their inflation targeting framework in their mission statement. They set specific numerical targets for inflation for a specific measure of year-on-year inflation. Central banks in emerging markets and medium-sized economies have increasingly adopted an inflation targeting monetary policy framework. In this framework, the government, in consultation with the central bank, sets a target for inflation over some medium-term future. Over the last 15 years, a number of East Asian economies have explicitly adopted an inflation targeting framework. We outline the 5 key characteristics of an inflation targeting monetary policy. Number 1, explicit quantitative targets for inflation. Number 2, unambiguous communication to the public that the inflation target has priority over other goals. Number 3, a model of inflation forecasting based on multiple inputs. Number 4, a forward-looking operating procedure, adjusting the instruments to align inflation with the target. And number 5, systems of accountability for adhering to the inflation target. As an example, let's see how this applies to the Philippines. Number 1, quantitative targets. The inflation targets have been set at 3%, plus or minus 1 percentage point for 2017 and 2018, and at 3% plus or minus 1 percentage point again for 2019-2020. The central bank sets the target 2 years in advance. The inflation targets are adjusted over time to be consistent with achievable inflation. Number 2, the inflation target has priority. The Central Bank of the Philippines presents its mission statement on its inflation target. The political arm of the government, along with the central bank, develops a target for inflation, which the central bank commits to achieve over a 2-year horizon. Price stability is identified as the main priority. The inflation target guides expectations of future inflation. The target is specified in terms of the headline CPI. Number 3, a model of inflation forecasting based on multiple inputs. The central bank constructs a mathematical model of the economy. Using this model, the central bank inputs recent information governing trends in the economy, demand-side factors, commodities prices, and other leading indicators of inflation. Once these are entered into the model, the central bank can construct a forecast of the future path of inflation. Central banks regularly publish forecasts of future inflation to guide expectations of future monetary policy actions. These forecasts present the full probability distribution of the forecast of future inflation. Darker areas indicate likelier outcomes. Number 4, forward-looking operating procedures. The central bank adjusts policy rates not on the basis of current inflation, but rather on their forecasts of future inflation. They will make today's policy on the basis of tomorrow's inflation. If the central bank forecasts that future inflation will be above the target range, they will raise interest rates. The purpose of raising interest rates will be to reduce the output gap and slow inflation. If interest rates are raised sufficiently, this will bring the path of inflation back to the target range. Likewise, when the forecast of the future path of inflation is negative, then the central bank should cut rates, stimulating demand, raising the output gap, increasing pricing pressure, and ultimately bringing inflation into the target range. Consider a recent easing cycle in the Philippines in 2011-2012. During that period, the inflation target was 4.5%, with a range of tolerance between 3.5% and 5.5%. The inflation target was reduced to 4%, plus or minus 1%, at the end of 2011. Through much of late 2011, core and headline inflation were very stable, near the center of the inflation targeting range. During 2011, the monetary policy rate was set at 4.5%. But in the monetary policy meetings in January and March of 2012, the Policy Committee announced a cut in the policy target, first to 4.25%, then to 4%. Why was the central bank cutting interest rates when inflation was stable? Though the path of inflation was indeed within the target range, economic conditions in the Philippines were turning negative. In a quarterly report on inflation conditions, the central bank projected a sharp decline in inflation over 2012, with a serious risk of inflation going outside the range of tolerance. In a summary statement from a meeting with the highlights of the Monetary Policy Committee meeting, the committee sees poor conditions emanating from the international economy. We use data on the growth rate of GDP to estimate the output gap. Slow economic growth in 2011 turns into a negative output gap. Indeed, though year-on-year inflation was in the middle of the range at the end of 2011, by early 2012, the negative demand pressures had pushed inflation down below the range of tolerance. Why does the central bank adjust the interest rate based on inflation forecasts? Changes in interest rates affect demand, but the economy takes some time to adjust its spending pattern to a change in interest rates and asset prices. Thus, there is a lag between policy changes and changes in spending patterns. If monetary policy only affects future aggregate demand, then today's policy must be set for tomorrow's economic conditions. Returning to the Philippines in 2012, we see that the central bank ultimately cuts the policy interest rate as low as 3.5%. This stimulates demand and inflation, but inflation remains below target for more than a year, and only after a year does the output gap close to zero. If it takes a year for monetary policy to stabilize demand, then policymakers must be forward-looking. Number 5, transparency and accountability. A key element of inflation targeting is an approach to transparency. Changes in the monetary policy stance have more consistent effects when the market understands the central bank's intentions. Further, the economy will adjust more smoothly when there are fewer policy surprises. Central banks have a number of communications channels, including immediate announcement of changes in policy, the reporting of Monetary Policy Committee meeting minutes and highlights to explain policymakers' understandings and intentions, and regular publication of economic data and relevant forecasts. This strategy may be supplemented with press conferences and testimony that allows the public and the government to understand policy actions. A feature of inflation targeting is clear mechanisms of accountability. When inflation goes outside the allowable range, central banks must acknowledge this. Channels of acknowledgement include testimony to the legislature or open letters to the public or the government. Here is an example from the Central Bank of the Philippines, which acknowledges inflation was very slightly lower than the range of tolerance and what future actions would be undertaken in response. To sum up, inflation targeting is a strategy that sets an intermediate target for a macroeconomic variable closely connected to price stability. This is the forecast of consumer price inflation. The framework offers a mode of adjustment of the interbank rate operational target in order to achieve the macroeconomic target. Now that we've concluded this segment, you should be able to 1. Characterize the inflation targeting monetary policy framework. Inflation targeting is a monetary policy framework that connects the operating target of interbank interest rates with the policy goal of low and stable inflation. It does so by setting a numerical target for the future path of inflation. The central bank uses a wide variety of macroeconomic information to construct a forecast of future inflation. Monetary policy is adjusted to push future inflation towards the target. Thus, the forecast of the inflation could be said to operate as an intermediate target. When the inflation forecast is above target, the central bank could raise interest rates. This should slow demand and put downward pressure on future inflation. When the inflation forecast is below target, the central bank can reduce interest rates, raise demand, and put upward pressure on future inflation. Now that we've seen the main structure of the inflation targeting framework, let's examine in the next segment how central banks actually conduct an inflation targeting monetary policy.